So I would like to thank our Dean, Professor Danielle van Malmeder, for her very generous introduction. I'm really grateful you've been able to attend this event at a time when faculty exams have just ended, and I think the beginning of the semester is really literally tomorrow, more or less. I also would like to thank Dr. Juliette Vuy for her equally kind summary about an academic life spent both with the mystics and myself. I do not know who was easier to live with during all these years, the mystics or myself, but I can for myself say that it has been wonderful to first supervise Dr. Vuy many years ago now, followed by really happy collaborations as she made her way up in our department. Her enthusiasm for teaching and research is only equal to her dedication to the field of medieval English studies. And yes, I sort of thought and knew there was going to be a Festschrift, and really again, thank you very much for the Festschrift. I'm really amazed to see so many great colleagues, either as contributors or as part of there is a tabula congratula, which I haven't looked at, but it's nice to see so many people being mentioned and taking part in this event in a way, in this way. Thank you so much to all of you, and especially thanks therefore to Rory and Juliet for all the work you have put into the editing of this volume. Rory, you will be mentioned later on in my talk, so there is a special slot for you. Many more people need to be thanked today, and I will not manage, of course, to thank all of you in person, but I must mention first the late Marquis de Amodieu, the founder of the Barrow Foundation that was mentioned by Juliette, who made it possible for me to pursue doctoral studies at Lincoln College, one of the colleges at the University of Oxford, and I think without the generous financial support of the Barrow Foundation, and hence the possibility to study with Vincent Gillespie, I would not have had the same career. I'm very grateful to the Marquise de Amodieu, present here today, who is continuing the work and mission of her husband. The Barrow Foundation offers every year up to 7 3-year scholarships to study any subject offered at the University of Oxford. I cannot emphasize enough how I benefited from my stay in Oxford, both as an academic and a human being. An introduction is planned in Lausanne in 2 weeks' time. Check the agenda and come. I will be there and introduce it with Juliette because I really think it's been wonderful for me, and it will be wonderful for the students who are interested in that as well, in applying. Soon after my return from Oxford, I held a position of maître assistant and then MER, maître d'enseignement et de recherche at the University of Fribourg, where I taught for 10 years before coming to Lausanne. Late Professor Anthony Mortimer was a great mentor there, giving me endless encouragements and working all the time I was in Fribourg in order to create a permanent professorial position in medieval English at the University of Fribourg, which was achieved soon after I was appointed as full professor here at the University of Lausanne in 2005. Elizabeth Dutton is professor at the University of Fribourg now, and it's wonderful to have her as a colleague and to have her in the volume as well. So I have had the chance to work under several deans who all provided the best possible conditions for teaching and research here. André Wyss, Anne Billman, Alain Boyat, François Rosset, Dave Lutti, Leonard Burnand, and Danielle van Malmeder, thank you for your hard work and dedication to our faculty. I hope I haven't forgotten anyone in that list, but... Colleagues from the English department, the Centre d'études médiévales et postmédiévales, known as the CEMEP, and from the faculty more generally should also be thanked. Our collaborations have been most fruitful and constructive, generating wonderful interdisciplinary conferences and doctoral workshops. I enjoyed many rewarding collaborations with colleagues from the CEMEP, and it is my pleasure to mention here Jean-Claude Multhaler, especially with whom I founded the CEMEP. I don't think that anyone, I'm sure no one, will contradict me in saying that the English department is one of the most collegial English departments I know in Switzerland and beyond. It has been a privilege to work with all of you, past and present colleagues, and I would like to thank you for your support and friendship all these years. But I want to thank especially my colleague Jörg Schwitter, who welcomed me so warmly in the English department after my arrival on the 1st of August 2005. Thank you, Jörg. With regard to medieval English studies, it has been my pleasure throughout those years to work with wonderful colleagues so that our little community of medievalists thrived within the department. Lucy Perry, Marco Nivergeld, Sarah Baccianti, Marlene Cray, Juliette Vu, Mary Flannery, Diana Dennison, Christiania Whitehead, of course, and Rory Critton have all contributed to the teaching and research in medieval English throughout those years. We also had the pleasure of welcoming several chargés de cours, including Professor Dieter Bitterli and Dr. Lucy Kempfer, who gave a wonderful paper just an hour ago in our conference. This is without mentioning past and current doctoral students who also play a huge role in the teaching of our subjects within the faculty. I'm pleased to say that Ana Rita Pareiras-Rez, Hazel Blair, Mireille Lebert, Chen Tsui, and Olena Danilovic are close to submitting their doctoral thesis, and so will keep me busy and on my toes for this next year or so. And I see with great pleasure also some of our BA and MA students in the room. And I must conclude these words of thanks by paying tribute to you. Your curiosity for a period and texts that were not just foreign, but really exotic for some of you, and for me as well initially, has stimulated me for all these years. Several of you have often commented on my enthusiasm for the classes I have taught, but I think you were the source of that enthusiasm, and your genuine interest in my field has been my motivation to help you develop further your own interests. Okay. The topic of my talk is not exactly what I had initially planned. It's not going to be a few observations, but it's going to be a focus, especially on one text. And the exercise of giving which I'm learning at the moment, of giving a leçon d'honneur, or in English it's not such a nice word, exaugural, so it means exiting. So I don't quite like that term. I prefer the leçon d'honneur to leçon d'adieu as well. But anyway, we've had a conference on the apophatic tradition, which I will talk a little bit about. It just ended an hour ago. And there are several specialists who know the text perhaps even better than I do. I need to try to keep their attention for a little while, but I also need to try to make that text accessible to a more general audience. It's a difficult text, so I hope I'm not going to lose you as I go along. Perhaps occasionally I will stop and I will ask you, are you still with me? So, the topic of my leçon d'honneur, I would like first of all to qualify slightly the title of my talk. Although I have spent a great amount of my time researching medieval devotional and mystical literature, I can assure you, and I hope you will believe me, when I say that but I think it's been confirmed by Juliette, that I also research other topics. I wrote a few pieces on Chaucer, on Robin Hood, with a wonderful archery workshop at the Chaucer weekend in Les Diablerets, on William Tell, on the convergence between medieval and medical and literary texts, on medieval translation, on relations indeed between the Pays de Vaud and England, with a specific focus on Othon III of Grandson. But I have to admit that I have always come back to medieval English religious literature, including Anglo-French literature. My doctorate on the mystic Richard Rolle was supervised by late Professor Vincent Gillespie, who was already in the late 1980s one of the most significant voices in the emerging field of medieval English religious literature. Opportunities for research were plenty, and thanks to Professor Gillespie, I was soon welcomed by several international scholars working in the field. So, as I fell in the marmite de la littérature médiévale anglaise religieuse, that's my only reference to great literary works, Asterix and Obelix, as an academic youngster, I never got out of it. and I'm happy to have worked with so many wonderful people researching in the field, many of whom are present in this room today. So it's a great honor for me to have you here. So this is more or less what I want to do during the time that I've got. So it's going to be on the text that exists in various versions. I will focus on the Middle English version. It's called the Mirror. So I'll talk a little bit about the structure, the content, and the voices in that text. And then also offer a few words about what is apophatic theology, and then focus on anthropological apophaticism, and then discuss 9 points which are offered in the text to explain what it means to live apophatically, and then talking about reader recognition, and then a coda conclusion. So, religious literature, it will be for the next 35 or 40 minutes or so, I'll see. I think the advantage of the exaugural is that we can do whatever we wish. I can keep you here for as long as I want. I think that's the... Anyway, I would like to introduce you to a text that has a most interesting history. Despite being burned soon after its completion in the first years of the 14th century, copies of this text nevertheless survived, circulated throughout Europe, and were translated into Italian, English, and Latin. Its author, a woman called Marguerite Porret, who lived from 1250 to 1310, was burned at the stake for not wanting to recount what had been considered the heretical content of her book. The book I have in mind, which was circulating in the French language, is called The Miroir des simples âmes anéanties, qui seulement demeurent en vouloir et désir d'amour. Marguerite Porret lived as a Béguine, that is a member of a semi-religious community in the town of Valenciennes, which was part of the county of Hainaut and is now in the French Département du Nord. The French version of this text is extant in only one manuscript, Chantilly, manuscript Condé F. 1426, written in a Gothic hand from the end of the 15th century, possibly early 16th century. The text was written in the Picard dialect of Old French, but exists in a Middle French version that is therefore quite distant from the original. In fact, some of the Latin and Middle English versions provide readings that are closer to the original text. To summarize, in addition to the French text, there are 10 continental Latin manuscripts of the Mirror of Simple Souls, 4 Italian manuscripts, 3 Middle English codices, and 1 Latin version translated from Middle English into Latin. The relationships between these manuscripts are extremely complex. I will not go into that today, but I can make a reference to a recent monograph written by Justine Trombley called A Diabolical Voice, which offers a most convincing narrative about the reception of the Latin mirror in late medieval Europe. I would like instead to focus my attention on the Middle English version only, which exists in 3 manuscripts found in Cambridge, in St. John's College, manuscript 71, in London, British Library, manuscript additional 37790, and then Oxford Bodleian Library, manuscript Bodley 505. These manuscripts contain the same version, which is provided with additional explanations in the form of glosses to some of the most difficult passages, glosses or explanations. The assumption about the Middle English version is that the French version, from which it was translated, circulated anonymously in England, so that no one knew that it had been written by a woman, no one knew that it had been condemned as being heretical, and no one knew that it had been, knew that it had been condemned as being heretical. In addition, no one knew or knows even today who provided the glosses. The person could be a man or a woman. I have decided, and I think I would I mean, we've been discussing that text for the last 3 days, and I think I'm more and more convinced that it would be best to use they rather than he or she. I've kept the he, but I'm very, very, I'm going to publish a version of this paper, and I'm very keen to use the they for that. I will keep the he, but I do think that it is quite appropriate to use they. But because all we know about that person is that he or she provided M and N, which stand as the first letters of his first name and last name to mark the beginning and end of the glosses. So that we call that person MN. So whenever he reads the text and he looks at the difficulties of the text, and when he thinks, okay, this is really, really complicated, I'm not sure that my readers will understand it, so I will add a little explanation which will start with the letter M and which will end with the letter N. So what is in between are really his explanations. So that's quite a fascinating way of really explaining a text, because usually you would have the glosses in the margins or in between the lines, but he really inserts himself into the text or herself in a very, very interesting way. I think I should perhaps read to you a little bit of the Middle English, but which is provided next to a rather old translation by Kirchberger, but which is, in terms of the content, it's still quite a good one. And you've got the French text on the handout. Therefore, at such places, daarmee semeth most nede, I wolle vrite mo wordes dertoe in manner of glose, after mi simple koning, as me semeth his best. And in deze fewe places that I putte in more than I finde written, I wolle beginne with the first letter of my name, M, and ende with this letter N, the firste of my surname. Then MN continues with the following to show, what the kind of difficulties, he's facing. The Frenche book that he shall write after is evil written, and in summe places of defaute of words and syllables, the raison is away. Not easy to work on such a text. Also, in translating of French, summe words needen to be changed, or it will fare ungodly, not according to the sentence. Very difficult to work with, a text that is not, such a very good copy, and then to make sense of it in another language. Not to mention what will be the main focus of my topic, the difficulty of the apophatic tradition, but that's for later. So, one of the reasons, quite clearly, that complicates the translation of this text is that the version that MN had at his disposal was a rather poor copy of the original text. Scholars agree on that, no doubt about it, they do. But on the other hand, they disagree on the other hand on the other possible difficulties that faced MN. Indeed, some scholars dispute some of the facts that I mentioned above. They claim he must have known the text had been condemned in the early 14th century, and that it had been also written by a female author. The two of them perhaps were the causes of the difficulty that medieval readers, including the readers of the Middle English text, had with the text. I personally argued in an article published in Études de Lettres, co-edited by my colleagues Lucy Perry, Kirsten Sterling, here present, Boris Wojciechowski, here present, in 2001. That was before I was professor here. I was a first assistant, 30%, I think. That although MN did not know that the text had been condemned and written by a woman, I was still considering that as something that was circulating anonymously. I nevertheless argued that perhaps the glossator felt uneasy with what we could argue was une écriture féminine. I have moved away from this perspective, and today I would like to focus rather on the difficulties linked to the complex apophatic theology and, more briefly, the notion of annihilation contained in the original treatise. So, a few words about the content and the structure of this text. Before I discuss the notion of apophaticism and annihilation, I would like to look at the structure and style of the mirror. The Mirror of Simple Souls is written in dialogue form with three main characters called Reason, Love, and the Free Soul or Simple Soul. Reason leads the exchange by asking questions about what to do in order to have a direct encounter with God. I can see my two children at the back, and I think they need a French version of that text. They arrived late, I just noticed. They are at the very back. That's the only occasion they will hear me give a lecture, so I think they should be into it. Okay, so where am I? Where was I? Yes, so before I discuss the notion of apophaticism and annihilation, I would like to look at the structure and style of the mirror. The Mirror of Simple Souls is written in dialogue form with three main characters called Reason, Love, and the Free Soul, or Simple Souls, as I've just said. Reason leads the exchange by asking questions about what to do in order to have a direct encounter with God. The prologue of this treatise provides information about the potential recipients of the treatise. Some could be in the active life, that is, probably officiating, for instance, as priests in a parish and looking after the spiritual well-being of their flock. Some in the contemplative life, that is, like Richard Roll. He's a hermit, as we have been told and by our dean, living in relative solitude and devoting their life to reading, prayer, and meditation. And last, the third group, the commune peuple, or common people, are those, in my view, living in the world who are busy with temporal concerns. The path of self and divine discovery that is offered in a treatise is organized according to 7 degrees of perfection, which can be subdivided into 3 main phases, quite well known in the Western mystical tradition, that is, purgation, illumination, and union. All of this sounds quite well organized and structured, but in fact, the mirror is anything but structured and organized. It does not work according to an evolving logical sequence, but rather in a cyclical way with repetitions and enlargements upon statements. It proceeds in a spiraling fashion, meandering its way back and forth till it describes the highest state of the spiritual life. Another complication, of course, is linked to those different voices that I've mentioned. So I would like to talk a little bit about the voices in this text. As mentioned above, there are several voices in the Middle English mirror. Those of the characters who are part of the narrative, that is the simple soul, reason, and love. A few other fictitious voices appear within the narrative, but I will leave these ones out of my consideration for today. On the other hand, there is also an I voice that represents Marguerite Porret, the author, who sees herself as having reached the state of the simple soul, that is a state of divine union with the divine. In addition to this voice, which exists outside of the narrative, there is, of course, the additional voice of the translator, glossator, MN, whom I mentioned before, who does not consider himself to have reached the level of the simple soul, and who also believes that some of his readers may, like him, be quite unfamiliar with what this particular privileged and elitist status may entail. His voice appears most forcefully in the 15 glosses that he offers throughout the mirror. MN, that translator glossator, wants to clarify and, when necessary, correct a text that offers difficult passages, as I've mentioned before. He also invites his readership to read the treatise several times in order to reach a correct understanding. The style of the Middle English mirror is well represented, of course, in MN's glosses, which do not depend on French idioms and words that he needs to translate. However, on the whole, the Middle English text follows the French in its use of rhetorical figures, and I'm not going to list them, but mention one of them. The most common one is, in fact, the use of paradoxes, which, of course, fits well with a treatise that attempts to describe the undescribable divinity. You will soon see that several of the quotes I have chosen highlight this aspect. The dialogic exchange, which takes place between reason, the simple soul, and love, is central to the treatise, as it shapes its style and has a significant bearing on the delivery of its pedagogy. Within that exchange, reason usually asks questions which are most often answered by love, and occasionally by the simple soul when she considers that she has sufficient experience in the subjects asked about. The dialogic exchange plays a significant role in enabling the repetition and consolidation of the information that the reader needs to digest in order to come to an understanding of what it means to be a simple soul. That's the moment, I think, for me, well, perhaps to have a sip of water and then to enter into the apophatic tradition. We're making good progress. It's not going to be too bad in terms of the length. I must pause briefly to describe what is meant by apophatic theology. Not for those of you, of course, who have taken part in the conference, but for the more general public. The webpage of our Swiss National Foundation for Research project offers explanations about both the cataphatic and apophatic traditions in the Christian contemplative life. The cataphatic tradition starts from the premise that a number of qualities can be affirmed about God. His nature has love, his goodness, and the possibility of knowing with the imagination, reason, and affects, the feelings, if they are properly focused on divine knowledge, are very, very good and useful. Of course, his creation can also be observed and offer information on his creator. And also, the life of Christ on earth, and especially the events of the Passion, can generate feelings that will bring one closer to the divine. Those are the main aspects of the cataphatic tradition. Apophatic, negative. In contrast to this tradition, the apophatic tradition seeks to erase sensory perceptions and to strip away all that can be known about God, leading the disciple instead toward a place of darkness and cognitive obscurity. So the premise here in that tradition is that God cannot be apprehended imaginatively, sensorially, or cognitively. What do you do then? That's the problem. There is a long tradition of this apophatic tradition, but the main proponent of apophatic theology in the West is a person who chose to write under the pseudonym of Dionysius the Areopagite, the Athenian convert of Paul the Apostle mentioned in Acts 17:34. In fact, he must have been a Syrian monk of the late 5th to early 6th century. He wrote several treatises, some of them short, but however sometimes impenetrable. He's the author of the Divine Names, the Mystical Theology, the Celestial Hierarchy, the Ecclesiastical Hierarchy, and some letters, which are available in modern English translations with the classics of Western spirituality. He's considered as the main proponent of the apophatic approach to the divine. The apophatic approach to the divine invites one to consider what God is not and enter, therefore, in a state of unknowing and self-emptying. Just a few words about another author who really follows that tradition in medieval England and who is the main proponent of the apophatic tradition in 14th century medieval England. He's an anonymous author who we name as the Cloud Author with reference to his most significant treatise, The Cloud of Unknowing. He uses the image of the cloud to describe the mental state one should place oneself in order to experience the divine. He considers, indeed, that once one has pushed all unnecessary thoughts below a cloud, which is the cloud of forgetting, one may start to pierce the darkness of the cloud of unknowing, which is above, with a sharp dart of longing love to possibly experience divine grace. To sum up, apophatic theology proposes a state of mind or a state of soul that entails giving up cognitive faculties, emotional states, and imaginative considerations. Although it remains strongly anchored, of course, within the Christian tradition, its search for self-emptying and noting has affinities with the tradition of Zen Buddhism, for instance. In my view, the Mirror of Simple Souls works according to these premises, even if it has idiosyncrasies with regard to notions of the will and the ultimate state of annihilation that I will come back to briefly in my conclusion. I will not have time today, of course, to discuss apophaticism in the Middle English Mirror as a whole. Instead, I would like to focus on the concept of anthropological apophaticism. It's not as complicated as one may think. So I've just told you about apophaticism, God, and the fact that one cannot know it in any way, rationally, sensorially, and so on, imaginatively. And one can say the same, in a sense, in the mirror for the soul. Anthropological apophaticism transfers the notions discussed above from the divine to the self, so that the self, or the soul, in the words of the scholar Charles Stang, is cleared away of its own names, unsaid, rendered unknown to itself. And this anthropological apophatic anthropology, is present in the works of Pseudo-Dionysius as well. A close reading of certain passages from the Mirror shows that the simple soul's absorption into the divine is such that the text has recourse to apophatic anthropology to describe its own state. But this is difficult and paradoxical, since the task of conveying the apophatic contemplative experience textually requires, of course, the use of the rational faculty. So the simple soul who has moved beyond reason, and that's a point that, Marguerite Porret, who says, that's me, I'm the I voice, she really states quite clearly that she's one of those souls, but she needs to come back and to go back to reason, will and feeling, and reclaim them temporarily during the act of writing. So this I voice, who claims to be one of the chosen souls, who has a privileged relationship with the divine that words cannot convey, finds herself in a difficult situation when she attempts to share this experience with a soul who has not yet reached that level. Indeed, how does one describe a state characterized by an absence of will and reason? Well, this is the dilemma of the simple soul, by proxy Marguerite Porret, who nevertheless feels the need to convey this experience. For that, she therefore needs to compromise, as of course post-Lapsarian language conveys meaning through the use of the rational faculty, and needs the will to convey affective stages that may be shared with the readership. Yet, the knowledge that these human faculties ultimately fail force the simple soul to rhetorically short-circuit the rational and emotional flow of her narrative by creating linguistic aberrations. I'm not sure that's the best term, but for instance, one of the ways by which the Mirror defines the state of the simple soul is by emphasizing her awareness of unknowing. I should say, rather perhaps aberrations, that's the paradoxes that we are going to be facing, quite a few of them. So this is her difficulty, that she tries to describe a state that is undescribable using post-Lapsarian language. So she says, the more that the soul hath of knowing of the divine bunte, the more she knoweth that she knoweth not the muntans of a mortar as in regard of his bunte, the which is not comprehended but of himself. So the apophatic state consists therefore in being aware of one's own complete unknowing of what the divine really is. It also goes along with giving up any intention of seeking to know what it may be. That awareness of knowing that she knows nothing about God, as he is without comprehending, precipitates the simple soul into the necessary state of unknowing that makes annihilation possible. From this highly introspective and self-reflexive position, to assume to be generated from a perspective that has got rid of will and reason, the soul visits one of the early stages when she was not in that stage, but living according to the basic of the church, that is following, for instance, the virtue. So she was up there, but she revisits the time when she was perhaps not there and living according to the basic, tenets of the church. So from this newly acquired status of unknowing without willing, so the perfect state in which one should be in order to have that contact with the divine, the description of the previous state of blind obedience to the virtues is described with words such as thraldom, thraldom, servage, tormentes, and painus, which all support the notion that a life lived in accordance with the 7 capital virtues, chastity, temperance, charity, diligence, kindness, patience, humility, is marked by a lack of spiritual ambition. Indeed, this volitional and rational practice of the virtues is made to stand in complete opposition to the unwillful and reasonless state of unknowing of the simple soul. Difficult text, isn't it? Okay, yes. So we hear from the Middle English text the following: the sulle of such a love saith love himself, may say thus to virtues, itac leve of you. If you have reached the state that she described, you don't need to live according to virtues. You're far beyond that. But of course, to dismiss the usefulness of the 7 virtues, one of the cornerstones of Christian theology, is a very challenging move. In view of its possible textual circulation among a spiritually unprepared audience, M.N., our glossator translator, offers additional information about the way in which the leave-taking of the virtues forms part of a larger process by which the soul begins to experience more directly the love of God. At this point, so he says, the soul is no longer at war against the vices, that is lust, gluttony, greed, sloth, envy, wrath, pride, and therefore no longer in need of the virtues. Rather, she rejoices in the peacefulness afforded by this new state. M.N. tries to really explicate that very difficult move on her part, and I think he provides sensible, down-to-earth information according to his understanding about the state of the simple soul living in a state of unknowing. I should mention that this glossator translator does not claim that he has reached that state himself. So he's perhaps able to really understand better than Porret herself what the problems may be. Okay, then as I said, the text is not incredibly well structured, but there is nevertheless a moment when we get an explanation about the 9 points, which could be used as a way of, trying to understand what it means to live apophatically. So, what does it really mean, indeed, to live apophatically while living in the physical world, be it a béguinage, a monastery, or the secular world? Porret's text is not known for being very systematic. Indeed, as I have mentioned before, it works through repetition, addition, circularity, divisions, and subdivisions. However, reasons pressing questions addressed to Lady Love leads her to offer a list of 9 points which define the simple soul and the spiritual realm she inhabits, all expressed in terms of what she must abstain from doing or what she is not. I will only discuss a few of these points and perhaps more summarize them than really develop them, but I shall nevertheless mention the entire list as it summarizes, I think, the most important aspects of the treatise Spiritual Doctrine. So it begins with an interesting point: sin is nothing, and even less than nothing. That's quite apophatic. So in fact, the soul, it realizes that she's sinful, and therefore, if she thinks about that, she may already have a sense of this notion of noting nothingness. The soul, in fact, by understanding that, is noted by meekness. Number 2, the soul saves herself by faith without work. A noted soul, or soul reduced to nothing, has such a great inner knowledge by the virtue of her faith that she's entirely focused on the inner and cannot do the works of mercy. The simple soul is completely alone in her love, with no comfort, affection, or hope from creatures on earth and in heaven. Her focus is exclusively on the goodness of God, which is perhaps unknowable. The soul does nothing for God because God loves her so much that she cannot love herself. The soul does not live for God because there is in fact nothing within her that goes against God's will. No one can teach her. She has much knowledge, but she loves so much that which is in God, that is, knowledge is reduced to nothing. Man cannot destroy her as God dwells within her. Man cannot give her anything because it would be nothing with regard to God, whom she loves and shall love. The simple soul has no will. What she consents to will is solely in accordance with the will of God within her. Very, very, I think, theologically difficult points to defend, and I think, one can perhaps see why some would have thought that this was heretical. But the first point emphasizes the fact that the simple soul lives in a space marked by a form of love, which is called fine love, which, of course, brings us to the fine amour tradition, which, of course, is part of the text as well, but which I can't discuss today. But this fine love can only be experienced in the state of unknowing and annihilation, in which sin is reduced to nothing or even less than nothing. Secondly, point 2, the simple soul inhabiting that spiritual sphere lets God work through her so that she lives only through faith by believing in the goodness of God without attempting to understand it. She therefore does not do works of mercy, as I've mentioned before, either the corporal ones, which consist of feeding the hungry, giving water to the thirsty, clothing the naked, sheltering the homeless, visiting the sick, visiting those in prison, and burying the dead, nor the spiritual works of mercy, which consist in instructing the ignorant, counseling the doubtful, admonishing the sinners, being patient with those who do wrong, forgiving offenses, comforting the afflicted, praying for the living and the dead. So all of those precepts are, of course, very important precepts of the Christian tradition. It's not that she doesn't think they are good, but she's just beyond that. MN intervenes as part of this seventh gloss because he really senses, okay, that could be perhaps problematic. To explain that in fact, it's not that she doesn't do them, but that it is God who is agent in the simple souls at that level. And that the simple soul's performance of these works are not hers, but are God. So she does not take credit for them as he works his will through her. His interpretation to tone down a behavior that ordinary Christians would consider to be a failing in the basic of the teaching of the Christian faith, I think is very worthwhile thinking about. The third point highlights the fact that the simple soul, who is in a state, perhaps I should go back to those. The third point highlights the fact that the simple soul, who is in a state of annihilation, is absorbed exclusively by God and not at all focused on earthly or even heavenly creatures. Christ, the Virgin Mary, the saints, it's below. It's no longer any of her concerns and her focus. But point 4, mentions that she does not enter that state because of the love of God, since in fact it is God's will within her that has taken control of all agency. That soul therefore fears nothing and expects nothing and has her entire faith in God, so that she does not even fear becoming spiritually poor or deprived of God's love. As her will has been given up in favor of the will of God, she cannot do things for God, since she has given up any intentions, even of a spiritual nature. Intention and yearning are absent from her spiritual horizon by this point. In that particular state, as discussed in the 6th point, a superabundance of knowledge can be regarded as nothing when compared to her love for an imperceptible, unknowable entity. The 7th point shows the degree to which the simple soul is now immune to the harm or good directed towards her by other souls, so that the simple soul is still inhabiting a body, has no fear of death, since she cannot be deprived of the presence of God within herself. I think it's interesting to know that Marguerite Porete was given the chance perhaps to recant, but I mean, if one considers that all of those points, it would have been a complete negation of her apophatic mysticism if she said, okay, I recant. Because she says specifically, the simple soul is not afraid of dying, because she will lose nothing by that. So I think that it was a kind of interesting logic in her not recanting. And we know that was, I forgot the name of the other person who was being judged, who did recant, but for different reasons, and perhaps didn't have this conviction that Marguerite Porete had herself. The free soul cannot receive anything worthwhile from men, considering what she loves, and will continue to love in a state of unknowing. According to Emen, anything other than the blind love for God is a deception that the free soul or simple soul has given up. Finally, the last point touches upon another theologically sensitive point, the fact that the free soul no longer has any will. Indeed, volition has been given up so that God's own will can gain agency within the free soul. This soul hath no will, but the will of God, that maketh her will all that she oweth to will. So the absence of reason and the substitution of her own will for the will of God, as discussed in point 9, brings the I voice to offer her own glows to the complex phenomenon of noting that has brought the character of reason into a state of confusion. So there is in that text, as you know, the character of reason, who is very instrumental in asking the questions, but since everything that the simple soul is beyond reason, reason at once says, okay, I can know more, I'm not understanding. And that's, of course, logic, since all that is to be experienced is beyond reason and unknowing. So she thinks the reason that the soul wills to have a will which God wishes on her behalf as well, but which she cannot have. I mean, as a result of all of those considerations, reason believes that, in fact, the simple soul is brought into a state of lack rather than sufficiency. But this argumentation by reason is deemed by a new character which comes quite late. It's not love, but it's the highness of understanding of love, which Olena and I are still trying to distinguish between love. The highness, Olena is writing a thesis with a chapter on Marguerite Porete, so we've been talking quite a lot about Marguerite Porete together. The highness of understanding of love suddenly appears, and it seems to be someone other again. But it means perhaps just the capability to understand through love. But this character really criticizes reasons and thinks that her argumentation lacks subtlety and to be full of rudeness, really, really not good, lacking completely in sophistication, failing to reach to the kernel and only managing to crack the shell. It's interesting that we've got quite a heavy use of hermeneutic practice, which of course require very rational ways of dealing with things. So the use of hermeneutic practice in a text that shies away from rational and methodological considerations brings about linguistic destabilization and general confusion that can possibly bring the reader to a state of ecstatic inebriation beyond reason. I don't know. Dat een soele nuchted heeft nucht of wille, ne nucht me have, ne nucht me wille. I think one could spend an hour discussing the real meaning of a sentence like that. But accumulation and a relentless repetition of linguistic utterances, as well as circular argumentation, bring about a semantic unpredictability that forces the reader to move away from rational understanding. Reason indeed recalls to love that this semantic instability, which she has labeled as the double wordes, is not to be decoded for the commune peuple, who, unlike the simple souls, dwell in will and desire. And she says, so that's reason. This book saith great merveilles of the soule, that saith she ne recketh of shame, ne of worship. Please note the ne, the sort of negative language, ne of poverte, ne of richesse, ne of aise, ne of disease, ne of love, ne of hatte, ne of hell, ne of paradise. And also it says that the soule hath all, and she hath nocht. She wote all, and she wote nocht. She willeth all, and she willeth nocht. Ne she ne desireth se redon despite, ne poverte, ne no martyrdom, ne tribulation, ne sermons, ne fastinges, ne horizons. And she geveth to nature all is asking with un gruching of conscience. The last sentence again, we are still considering what it may mean. But the simple soul, with Olena, the simple soul pays no attention whatsoever to shame, worship, poverty, ease or unease, disease, love, hate, hell or paradise. This moment in the early part of the mirror really serves to shock the readers inexperienced in apophatic concepts by inundating them with negative language. The proper couching of linguistic utterances depends on a category of rational factors such as grammatical and lexical coherence, so that the principles of apophatic contemplation can be, of course, rationally absorbed, yet after that they need to be rejected for the soul to move beyond them. Reason attempts to explain apophatic contemplation while overtly admitting defeat, really, in reaching a proper final explanation, since apophatic contemplation takes place beyond reason. Love then joins the dialogic exchange and plays a significant role in informing reason about the higher spiritual level of the annihilated soul. Love's authority is premised upon an unmediated transmission of information between herself and God. The simple soul gets lost in the abundance of knowing offered to her by God, by a love, and becomes noted in her understanding. I think it would be very interesting to really check the number of biblical quotes that we have or have not in that text. I think there aren't so many. I haven't really worked on them, but I don't think there are so many, because in fact, again, the biblical text is perhaps not really providing information about that particular state. So the persistent attention given to the apophatic characteristics of the simple soul in the mirror is impressive. In fact, much of the first half is devoted to the simple soul rather than God. I mean, in a sense, the apophatic tradition normally, or not normally, but I think a lot of attention would be given to what God is not. But here, and it's not completely exceptional, but I think Porret's text really focuses much more than perhaps the other apophatic texts on this apophaticism as present in the state of the soul. So it's really, most of the first half is really devoted to the simple soul rather than God, with the use of negative language to denote her essentially apophatic nature and the relinquishment of the practices characterizing souls who have not yet reached that status. This soule ne desirus and this spit, I'm not sure whether have I got this. Yeah, never mind. Dis sule ne desireth dispite, ne poverte, ne tribulation. I'm just repeating. Ne disese, the quote before, ne masses, ne sermons, ne fasting, ne horizons, and she giveth to nature all that he asked without grudging of conscience. As part of the annihilation process, the soul gives back to nature all that has become unnecessary by this point in order to reach union with the divine. That's how I understand that last sentence, but to be discussed further. I'd like to talk a little bit about reader recognition, and I'm done in 5 minutes or so. So, reader recognition, the point we currently made in the Middle English Mirror is that perhaps some of the readers will recognize themselves as one of the simple souls chosen to enter a privileged experience that remains unsaid. This process of recognition is possible by understanding the role played by love rather than delving into rational considerations. For indeed, the character of reason in the treatise confesses his fallibility as to a teaching which goes against his own sense of spiritual priorities. Indeed, reason, and I call reason he, but again, to be debated. I think Marlene talked a little bit about that, I think, in the last day or so. Indeed, reason wishes to move the commune peuple to desire what it means to live as a simple soul, but has to admit defeat in delivering a clear message as none shall understand this book be mean understanding. So reason says no one is going to understand this book according to my own understanding, that is, according to rational consideration. So the state of the simple soul is that she neither wills or unwills any of the above, as she has given up her will in order to embody God's will. So although it may seem she has nothing, at the same time she has all, she knows all, and she knows nothing. She reaches the ultimate level beyond apophatic theology, the state of annihilation. So I'm reaching my coda. No. Annihilation. The Mirror is a difficult text, I think, in many different respects, as you can gather. I have not done justice to its complexity with my brief presentation today. Well, perhaps you don't think it's brief. It is a very peculiar, idiosyncratic text, one, some scholars would argue, that does not fit any of the categories used to define medieval spiritual texts. One of the persons who thinks that is in the room. I'm not going to point him out. Some would therefore question whether it is useful to define it according to the characteristics of texts that belong to the apophatic tradition, that is, to texts that propose a spiritual path that requires giving up cognition, affect, and imagination in order to hope through the gift of grace to have a direct encounter with the divine. However, one might argue that, in fact, the Mirror moves one step further along the path by adding to the state of unknowing that I've been constantly talking about and described by Pseudo-Dionysius, the notion of the annihilation of the will. Annihilation means really to become nothing, and thus to give up completely one's own desires, so much so that the annihilated soul desires nothing, not even the love of God. In that state of complete non-being, of non-desire, an absence of will, the soul becomes an annihilated soul, able to experience union with the divine. The ideal of annihilation, in fact, is not. It came about in the 1250s in the West in the course of theological innovations in Paris, which dealt with issues such as the divine potentia absoluta, the metaphysics of transubstantiation, and Francis of Assisi's concept and practice of humility. According to the scholar Barbara Newman, who was mentioned during our conference, the concept of annihilation then appears in the writings of Mechtild of Hackeborn, Angela Foligno, and, of course, Marguerite Porret, and perhaps even more importantly in Marguerite Porret. And thus seems to have appealed to female mystics throughout the continent against England. However, the notion of annihilation is also used in the writings of the Franciscans Ramon Lull and Jacopone da Todi. Nonetheless, I would argue that it is at its most developed in Porret's text, carrying it into different mystical sphere beyond the Dionysian imperative of unknowing. So, as you can see, this is definitely not the end of my investigation of the apophatic tradition in general, nor of the place of the mirror within that tradition. I will be very happy to continue my research on this topic in the next few years, as well as co-editing the chapters of the contributors of our conference, which closed only a few hours ago, for a volume of essays that we hope will be published by Brepols in more or less 2 years. And several of those chapters are going to be dealing with Marguerite Porete, but not only. But this Leçon d'honneur marks the end of my teaching career at the University of Lausanne, and I think rather than looking backwards, I would like to state how happy and privileged I am to know that medieval English studies are in very good hands for the next few decades. Thanks to an unprecedented scheme which allowed the University of Lausanne to create several shadow tenure-track assistant professorial positions, I have been able to work alongside my successor, Professor Rory Critton, for several years. His enthusiasm for medieval literature is contagious. He's a brilliant teacher, researcher, organizer, and a most collegial colleague. The scheme made it possible for him to assess what has been done in medieval English literature in the last 20 years at UNIL. I think there are some things that I'm sure will be continued under his leadership, but I have also no doubt that he will bring about innovations and adaptations. The fact that the scheme has allowed for a well-informed passing of responsibilities is a privilege that I wish everyone would have. It's a privilege and it was a luxury. I'm not sure it can be made again for at least some time. But because of that, and because I've got a success already, I'm really confident that medieval English studies will thrive in the hands of Professor Rory Critton and Dr. Juliette Vuille, who both hold permanent positions in the faculty. So, on that note, I would like to invite you to join me with an apéro, celebrating many more years investigating medieval literature and culture here in Lausanne. Thank you for your attention.